And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's special webinar, Latin America's Response to Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos.
Thanks, Marta, and thanks to all the panelists for being with us today. I echo Marta's comments on that. Bob, I think it's a good place to start is with you to help to set the table a little bit for the conversation that we're going to have over the next hour. Maybe you could help us a little bit. And why do you think, or why do you know, given you're still on the inside, why Prime Minister Carney felt compelled to make the speech? And also, what do you think are the three big takeaways from it? And if I could add a pile on a third one, is what do you think that people have read into it that you don't think exactly is in that speech, or he certainly wouldn't have wanted people to interpret in any the way that they may be interpreting it?
Well, first of all, I want to make it clear that so far as I know, and what I do know is that Mr. Carney wrote the speech. It was not a product of some corporate effort. It didn't come from a speechwriter or an outsider or anybody. It's very much his style of writing and his style of thinking. If you don't know him at all, I'm sure you know something about his background. He's former president of the Bank of Canada, former president of the Bank of England. So he understands the global economic system probably as well as anyone in the world, who's still a practitioner of understanding the dynamics of geopolitics and of economic policies around the world. So he has the credibility to give this kind of speech because he's not simply speaking as the Prime Minister of Canada from only a Canadian perspective. I think he sees what's happened as being particularly significant in the life of the world, and he wants to draw attention to it. One other personal comment I would make is, or observation I would make, is that he was the head of the Bank of England at the time of Brexit. And so he saw in real time what a rupture meant, looked like, and did, and the ongoing impact that it's had on the UK economy and on the global relationships more generally. So that's by way of background as to who is this guy and why is he saying these things. I think it's important to have that perspective. Obviously, he had several audiences. The global audience that was in the room and looking and reacting. The audience in Canada, with which obviously he's the most preoccupied. The audience in the United States as well, more particularly. We are in the middle of a difficult bilateral discussion that really focuses on two key issues. The first is the nature of the trade relationship between Canada and the United States. And secondly, the issues around security, particularly Arctic security, relations with NATO, with Europe, with Ukraine, which particularly concern the Canadian government. And so the speech has to be seen in that light. And the reason I say that he wrote it himself is I don't know any speechwriter that would recommend he refer to Thucydides and an aphorism from him in an attempt to sort of connect with the man in the street in Canada. I mean, it is sort of, you sort of say this is different. This is a different kind of cat who's writing this stuff. The background obviously is a difficult relationship that we're having with the U.S. at the moment, but it's also a broader observation about how everyone has responded to Trump's policies as they relate to Ukraine and to NATO and to Europe more broadly, and also how people responded to the imposition of unilateral tariffs by the United States and what that said about how things should perhaps have been done, but in fact how everybody ended up going to Washington and trying to get their own deal out from underneath this ridiculous set of tariffs that were introduced willy-nilly that had no logic or made any sense. And rather than the world coming together and trying to find some global response to what Mr. Trump was doing, because it was potentially so catastrophic, everybody just let the chips fall where they did, and then try to make a separate deal, which was pretty chaotic. The last context, I think, is the speech, is not the speech, but the paper that the Americans put out on the national security strategy, which the initial temptation was to sort of ignore it, pretend it hadn't happened, because it was so out of keeping with the way these things have been done before. And I think I think foreign offices and finance departments and defense departments around the world just completely underestimated what the importance of this document was, or how it actually reflected current thinking in Washington about how the world should work. And I know for a fact that struck Mr. Carney, that he thought people should take it very seriously and understand that there would be consequences that would flow from the document, that it was not just some intellectual fabrication of some eager staffer in the White House or in the National Security Council, but rather reflected much more the political approaches of the Trump administration, including the president himself. So what is the point of Carney's speech? Well, people can parse it as much as they like, but I think essentially there are three or four points that need to be understood. The first one is that things are different now, very different now, and people need to understand that although you can always see signs of continuity in American politics, American public administration, you can see signs of behavior that might say one thing but do another. Despite that fact, one has to recognize that there is a level of, as Mr. Carney used the phrase, rupture, of change, of significant change, that makes it impossible to really say in a logical way, we still live in a rules-based political order with international institutions like the WTO and other international institutions that must be respected and listened to, and et cetera, et cetera. And his question is, if that's the case, then what does that mean for the rest of the world? And again, another word that one does not fall easily off the lips of a lot of people. What are the differences between the hegemon, whoever the hegemon might be, and the other countries in the world that have less power, and in many cases have decided to fall in under the hegemon? It might have been more helpful if he'd been very explicit, but he chose not to mention countries by name, chose not to mention what particular powers he was referring to. I would suspect most Canadians know more about Pokemon than they know about hegemon. That doesn't matter. We all understand these are forces that exercise power and have an ability to exercise greater power over a number of other countries. And the simple point that I think Mr. Carney was trying to make was that those countries that have a sense of their own sovereignty, that have been part of the building of this world order since 1945, or actually since 1941, 42, which is when the sort of the intellectual roots of this approach were established. Many of us were partners in building this construct. And we now have to understand that the party that was the most important in building the structure has effectively left the building and decided they're going to do things their own way. And that is deeply troubling to anyone who wants to have a stable and predictable relationship with the United States. Given that level of unpredictability, and here I'm interpreting a little bit what Mr. Carney is saying, he's saying it's time for other countries, middle powers around the world, to get together and talk to each other more about how they want to respond to this rupture. Because unless we have the courage to say something terrible has happened, something significant has happened, although Mr. Carney did say, in words that I don't actually agree with, it said there's no point in mourning it. I think, frankly, there is some point in mourning it. There's a point in recognizing the moment and how what we tried to do was not nothing. It was quite significant. But he did make the point saying that nostalgia is not a strategy, and it's difficult to disagree with that at the moment. There's no point looking back and saying, gee, wouldn't it be nice if. We have to do something else, and that is to really try to embrace the need for greater predictability and for respect for those things that matter in terms of the stability of the global economic order and the need for everyone to behave accordingly. And I think the third message really is to Canadians, and to other countries as well, and that is to say we have to build our own resilience. We have to do more domestically, more nationally to strengthen our economy, to strengthen our security, because it is a discussion about not only about the economy, it's also a discussion about security. So frankly, to build our defense industries, not something that was on the political agenda for a very long time, to look at how we can police the Arctic successfully, how we can engage in Arctic security, and how we can be more effective in that regard. And I think it's, I would say that the attack on, or the whatever you want to call it, the attack on Venezuela, the bombing of the boats on the high seas, the ridiculous conversation about Greenland, which is still not concluded, the way in which that's been, in a sense, imposed as an agenda on the world, as opposed to doing something about the Ukrainian situation, which Canadians still feel very strongly about. That this is made the speech necessary at this time, in his view, that it is critically important for us to begin to have this global conversation that lets others know how we feel about it, and that includes Europe, that includes Latin America, that includes Asia, that includes Africa, and there are many middle powers in all of those continents, many countries that either working together or working separately can make a big difference in trying to push back on not only the approaches that the US is taking, but obviously push back on President Putin as well, and push back on regional powers that are trying to effect greater control over everyone's life without anybody saying boo about it. And I think that's something which is entirely healthy. Your last question is an interesting one. What is it that people have interpreted from it? I think people are underestimating the extent to which, in Canada's case, of course, we understand that we have a close relationship with the United States. Just to remind you of the numbers, 75% of our trade is with the United States. So we are a country that is also more than 50% of our GDP is dependent on trade. So we are enormously dependent on a successful relationship with the United States. And I don't think anyone should think that Mr. Carney is somehow saying that's not going to happen, or, not interested in pursuing that. That's not the case. That's not what he said, and it's not what he meant. What he said was, and what he meant was, our relationship with the United States is important to us, but it can't be the only thing that's important to us. We have a lot of other relationships in the world. We have a lot of other markets that we serve. We have a lot of other countries with whom we have close relationships. And we're not going to ignore those. We have to expand on those. And insofar as America has become an unpredictable partner and an unreliable partner, choosing to impose very stiff tariffs on 2 or 3 products, even though we have a free trade agreement, and just to do it and just persist doing it and never changing it, referring to Prime Minister Carney as the governor, which the president repeated again, which he also did with Mr. Trudeau. Generally speaking, just dismissing the importance of Canada and of Canadian society to the United States, which the president does constantly. These things make it extremely difficult for Canada to just be all chummy. And so as we say in Canada, elbows up is what we refer to as in a hockey game. And sometimes it's difficult to govern that way. But I think increasingly, because of the events the last few weeks, the Prime Minister felt he had to signal that there needs to be a broader global conversation about where we are. It's also a reflection of Canada saying as well to other countries, you want us to help you deal with problems. We need your help too. And the lack of what I call this alliance approach, or this joined up approach among countries around the world, faced with the unpredictability of Russia, unpredictability of the US, unpredictability of what China might or might not do in Taiwan, etc. It's important for countries to be talking more with greater confidence between each other and among each other about what is really happening, as opposed to this hub and spoke relationship, which everyone has with the United States, or for a few countries with Russia, and certainly with vast parts of the world with China. So that's, I guess, the background that I would put and my analysis of the speech. I think the reaction to the speech in Canada has been strong. Ironically, I think it's probably been stronger globally among certain commentators and others than it's been in our own country, because we live in a political climate where everything any political leader says is contested by the media and contested by the opposition. But I think in this case, I think the fact of the matter is the speech said some things which I think needed to be said. One can always quarrel or quibble with, what word was used or what language was used or not used. I think it is important to stress not only the value that Canada feels for its relationship with the United States, but also to be very clear that when we say that there has been a rupture, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in the United Nations or in the role of international institutions in getting us out of where we are. It's just that there's a sense that we have to explore more multilateral and bilateral relationships that will actually strengthen our mutual hands in dealing with the uncertainties and unpredictabilities of the world, which are increased by the election of President Trump and the pursuit of the policies that he's pursuing. This is a disruptive presidency. I think it would be a mistake to not understand that's intentional. It's intended to be disruptive because the administration feels that none of us have been doing enough and that we need to do more. The irony is that when we say, okay, we'll do more, we're going to go and talk to China, we get blasted for it. And I find that very ironic, because they say, we want you to do more. You say, well, we're doing more. And not only are we doing more, we're saying more about Greenland, for example, because we don't want you to take it over. We want to be part of whatever security arrangements are going to be arrived at for the entire Arctic. And Canada's more than willing to engage in serious discussions about what that will cost and whose share is what and how that gets done. The last point I would make is, I think the speech has something quite specific to do with the concerns that Canada now has about its own sovereignty in the face of the statements that have been made by the president about 51st state. And although I suppose after Greenland, we become the 52nd state. I don't know the order in which all these annexations are going to happen. But I think it's a serious issue for Canada. The president's, not only the president's statements, but the positions that the government of the United States has taken. The Secretary of the Treasury remarks about Alberta last week, where he fanned the flames of Alberta separatism quite deliberately and quite consciously. Canada is increasingly aware of the importance of our national sovereignty, of our territorial integrity, and what it's going to take to protect it in the face of these rumblings from the president and others about what they intend to do. And so this is a particularly Canadian issue. And I think our feeling is if countries aren't willing to stand up for the sovereignty of other countries, of Ukraine and Greenland, then they wouldn't be prepared to come to our defense either. And obviously, this is a deep concern for Canada. And I think has forced Canada to really look hard at what do we need to do to ensure that our territorial integrity is protected. And that's something we're looking at very hard. Not a pursuit of any kind of isolationism, but the need for us to become more resilient and to play a stronger role in our own defense and in the issues around protecting our sovereignty.
Thank you, Bob. You set the table perfectly. Let's move over to we'll start with Ricardo. You heard what Bob said about certainly what the intent was or his understanding of the intent and the key points in Mark Carney's speech in Davos. You were in the room in Davos. You're sitting at the CAF conference now, where they're in Panama, where they're heads of state. Is the way Bob just described it, has that been the impression? Have that been the messages that you think the leaders in Latin America or the political folks have heard in general in Latin America, and then we can get in later to specifically in Colombia, but just as a general point.
First, the answer is yes. But let me give you a little bit of background regarding that. That if Mark Carney had given this speech before the Canadian Parliament, for example, the reaction in the world would have been the same. In Davos. And the fact that this was the largest World Economic Forum ever in terms of having more than 60 presidents, having more than 3,000 delegates, and having more than 800 top CEOs, of course, made the speaker, that is Davos, much louder. And in that sense, it was not only who said it, but where he said it, and how he said it. And that made the speech very particular. The speech was uploaded afterwards. I forgot. I mean, I lost count in each and every intervention afterwards. Any speaker in different panels didn't have to do with geopolitics. They spoke highly of the speech, and so of course it is absolutely clear that this, in a sense, and I don't believe it's an overstatement, it's a speech for history. And the impact is that it was a wake-up call, and everyone took note. I mean, in the fact that this is serious. You can argue that yes, some people had. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen spoke first, and of course Emmanuel Macron spoke. But since this was the last important speech on last Tuesday, before Trump came to the podium on Wednesday, it is absolutely clear that he closed that evening sort of in really high marks. Now, the effects of that, I just saw this here in Panama, where I heard the president of Panama and Lula from Brazil speaking, and it is clear that the message is that, yes, middle-sized powers, including Latin Americas, have to get together because our strength can be achieved if we are united, and there's no doubt that this is a very divided continent or very divided region. We have, as we speak, a huge row between Colombia and Ecuador. Ecuador just imposed higher tariffs against Colombia's exports, increased the price it charges Colombia for transporting Colombia's oil in a pipeline that goes to the Pacific. Colombia retaliated in kind. It suspended the sale of electricity to Ecuador. And of course, this is just an example of how divided things are. So the message of the different presidents is, let's try to sort our differences and let's work together. Otherwise, it will be impossible to tame the beast, to put it in these words. And I think that that's going to be sort of the line in different regions, and Latin America is not exception to that.
Thank you, Ricardo. Hussein, Brazil, of course, plays an outsized role in the hemisphere, and certainly it has been President Lula's project for a long time to be a leader of the so-called global South, or whatever term we want to use or refer to or infer. So it'd be very, and we also know that it would appear, at least, that Lula and Carney are like each other, right? I mean, Carney invited Lula up to the G7 in Kananaskis. Lula went all the way up, just, I think, to be there for 24 hours, went back again, tweeted about his appreciation and to Mark Carney and the issues that they could work on together. He less than a month ago tweeted an invitation that he made to Prime Minister Carney, and Carney accepted to visit Brazil in the springtime. It hasn't been confirmed by the Canadian government, but that certainly is what President Lula is tweeting out. So it'd be very interesting to hear, how has Prime Minister Carney's speech been perceived in Brazil in general, and particularly amongst the political leaders and analysts, and for that matter, of course, the business class, as it were.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to me to participate in this panel with distinguished colleagues. Listen, Mark Carney's speech in Davos has been a pinnacle, and outstanding speech by all means, especially in the global South. I would say that even if Lula would have made that speech, would have resounding as strong as Carney made it. Why that? Because those words and how he framed it, being spelled from someone from the Western Hemisphere and from a Western country, have much more impact, and especially with the strong tie with the United States, rather than from, like me now, Latin American state or Southern American state. I would say I never ever imagined that Canada would play an independent foreign policy detached from Washington. Like here in Brazil, we never ever expected that, right? And basically, Trump compelled Canada to play it in this way, right? Very autonomous foreign policy, detached from Washington. Like we never ever expected that Mark Carney go to China to construct different alternative and to diversify Canada possibilities in terms of trade or geoeconomic vis-a-vis United States. If we compare Canada today foreign policy objectives and Brazil foreign policy objective, and Mark Carney's speech and Brazil foreign policy or Lula's speech in the global stage, they are very, very similar in many points, in vision, in objectives, and in principles, right? So, and that's why I see a lot of synergy and confluences between Canada and Brazil, and especially and particularly between the two leaders, right? And due to these convergences, we see also confluences between Canada and the Mercosur. The negotiation between Canada and Mercosur, they are in the pathway. They are moving forward. And one of the next visit of Carney to South America and to Brazil, it is how to advance also in the negotiation between Canada and the Mercosur as one alternative to Canadian foreign policy. Actually, what Trump ended doing to the world order, beside the rupture, he actually boosted a new geometric trade deals in the World Economic Order, where you see a lot of trade deal being struck across the globe, like Mercosur, European Union, yesterday, European Union and India. You will see Mercosur and Canada, and then you will see European Union. They are trying to strike a deal with the ASEAN, so Asia and the Pacific. So that is the Trump effect in the global stage. Do his I would say uh, uh, anarchic trade tariff policy, right? So from our perspective in South America, I would say like Mark Carney's speech in Davos, like it's very similar, and his demands and his I mean warning, it fulfill all the vision that circulates in the global south. So, like he looked like much more, I would say, like a global south leader rather than someone who belongs, I would say, like a leader in the Western Hemisphere, right? Or like he could fulfill both, but or because the West also is divided into blocks right now, like Trump's blocks, the two Wests, like the good West, and I would say like the the
You can
bad
say
West.
you can use the word bad if you want. That's okay.
You know, I mean, like the erratic the erratic West. I mean, you know, and one thing Trump's foreign policy doing in somehow it is an impacting its China power projection. I mean, like he is projecting Chinese power across the globe, directly or indirectly. If you look in the last 2 months, five Western leaders, they went to China to sign strategic trade deals, bilateral deals with China. France, UK, Finland, Ireland, and Canada to improve the trade relation, right? So he's now in China to attract investments and strike economic deals. That is Trump effect, right? That it is a great service, right? China doesn't have to move actually, geopolitically, right? They do not have to do nothing. The West is coming to China, and China is projecting power based on the new authoritarianism implemented by Donald Trump due his strategy based on military and economic coercion. That's what we are witnessing now, right? And Brazil is part of this this machination, right? What has happened in Venezuela definitely affect us. It was on our frontier, right? And how we perceive it is not on an operation, it is an attack. And wording in diplomacy, Bob knows it's very important. Not an operation, is an attack. It's not capture, it's kidnapping. We agree in Brazil that Maduro is illegitimate because we did not recognize his election, right? But the way how that proceeded, that was the first military attack on South America ever, right? So, and that was in fact unprecedented. So to Brazil, that represent a national security threat, by all means, right? If we want to look through it by several, whatever angle. And our concern has been always how we manage Venezuela. Our concern mainly was with the rising of authoritarianism, human rights, and etc. But Trump action there, it wasn't about all of that, rather than of changing the head of the regime and to replace the head of the regime and keeping the body of the regime. So basically, I mean, uh, preserving the regime in power and taking over the natural resources of the country. So we are talking here about, not the Venezuela is one case, but if you go to the Greenland, we are talking about expansionism, interventionism, and imperialism. That's what it's about. It is about domination and violation of the international law. That is the reality of the global order. And that is de facto the foreign policy of Donald Trump. And that affects us all. And what Mark Carney said in his speech, that we should have a realism based on value, where we should collectively act strategically in coalition, do shared mutual interest, because the only way to deal with the neo-authoritarianism based on military and economic coercion, it is to act collectively, do mutual interest in blocks. That's the only way to contain, in my opinion, the Trump administration. Otherwise, it will be impossible. And that's what European has to do Greenland. Otherwise, Trump will annex Greenland.
Okay, Hussein, thank you. I want to bring in the others again. We're going to absolutely come back. Thank you for that. Let's move to Robert. Chile is an interesting case for Canada, right? Canada is the largest, or certainly one of the largest foreign investors in Canada, in Chile. Chile has always, in a bipartisan way, hewed to the principles and extolled the virtues of multilateralism, with its faults and its, the deficiencies that may have been seen. But it has always struck me as one of the strongest defenders of the rules-based system. Briefly, how has this landed Carney's, and with an incoming, let's say, right-wing government? So it's unclear where they're going to pronounce on this. How do you think this is going to play out in Chile?
It already played out very positively, just anecdotally, just speaking to colleagues and friends, people who don't necessarily follow politics. And everybody, I guess because I'm Canadian, everybody was commenting on Carney's speech, which was it's very strange to have, people in social environments say, hey, your prime minister was really great. That doesn't happen all the time. So people really were attuned to what Carney said. The question is, what was it about, I guess this goes back to your very first question, Ken, but what was it that Carney said that really struck a chord in Chile? As you say, it's because Chile is a country that has been, for the last 35 years since the return to democracy, and because of the return to democracy, has had a foreign policy in right-wing governments and in left-wing governments that has basically been centered around multilateralism, free trade, or a liberal trade regime, and a rules-based order, and very, very conscious of being a small country, a small economy, that without those particular rules would be absolutely lost. I mean, Chile depends on exports, and therefore depends on a liberal trade regime, and so that now is up in the air. I think what Carney the second point, which is going back to the national security strategy. I think that was also received in Chile. The national security strategy really had an emphasis on Latin America, really had an emphasis on Latin American resources and rare earth minerals in particular. And we got that. we have those things that the United States says it wants, right? Copper, lithium, and others. And so when that happens together with Venezuela, and you sort of say, hey, anything could happen here. I don't think we would have a Venezuela in Chile, but there is an awareness that there's a kind of proactive, aggressive American foreign policy that doesn't just affect, Greenland or Canada or neighboring countries. It affects the entire hemisphere. That's what was laid out in the national security strategy. So when you have Carney come along and say, I think what Carney offered was not just the elbows up. Elbows up is a defensive approach. What Carney offered was an offensive approach. It was, we need to do something. We need to organize. We have the power to organize as middle power. I don't want to get all academic-y, but there's in the literature, there's a difference between middle powers and secondary powers, right? Secondary powers kind of have no real agency. They're kind of relegated to their secondary position, whereas middle powers say, if we, through the international system, through multilateralism, or just through our own, the power that we have through resources, our place in the world economy, and so on, we have agency. And so I think what Carney was saying was, Canada has agency, Europe has agency, countries like Chile have agency, but we need to organize. The other thing that I think was really striking about Carney was just how Canadian. I say this as a Canadian, but also as someone who's, just how Canadian he was, how calm he is. Compare that. There's a meeting. Ricardo's at GAF now. Compare it to Petro's approach or to other leaders' approach, or even Trump's approach. Carney was so. Mr. Ray shares this in a way with Carney. It's just cool, calm, and collected. And that is increasingly rare in the international sphere. And I think that really, together with the projection of power, is what hit the target. And finally, just regard to something that Hussein said about China. China is projecting power. It's got power, but it's also projecting order. China also wants order. So I think what we're entering into now is the division of the world between disruptive powers, right? And the United States seems to be placing itself on that side together with Russia and others, and those who want to have some kind of, it might not be a liberal order, but it'll be order. And I think middle powers are, what Carney does is say, let's, as middle powers, try to find a way of participating in this new system. It's really strange that the United States, the division into West and East, or liberal, illiberal, the United States is now kind of offside on all these things. And Latin America still sees itself as, for the most part of the liberal world order. So Carney, Canada, Europe, Latin America can organize, not against the United States, but at least around a kind of shared set of values that increasingly the United States doesn't seem to represent. The problem is, neither does China. So this kind of false dichotomy between having to choose between China and the United States is not really, I think, where the rest of the world, or the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria says, it's not where we are. We are basically have shared values, have power and agency, but we need to figure out whether that's through the UN or some other organization or what it is. And just to end on this point, it's not a coincidence that in the same sort of time period, President Trump announced his Board of Peace. Because again, that seems to be, look at the countries that participate in that. Again, it seems to be a kind of organization of a kind of order or world order that are those countries that don't seem to agree with this conglomeration that Carney represents. So I think that's why it really, people looked at him and said, there's a path forward. We don't know what it is, but let's, follow that path.
Thank you, Robert. Ricardo, we come back to you on Colombia, right? Each of these countries we picked actually, as you can see, has very different circumstances, which makes the compare and contrast easy, or interesting rather is the word. We would imagine that, well, we do know that President Petro would have been very much in favor of what Mark Carney said. At the same time, Colombia is dependent or is heavily involved in commerce with the US. It is also the target of security concerns of the United States, including threats of potential invasion that have been bantered back and forth in the US administration. And a president who's outgoing, and whose successor is, we don't know yet who that will be or what even political stripe or tendency will come from. You want to talk a little bit of how you think this is playing out in Colombia now and how it might play out even in the campaign in the next several months ahead?
No, what is important right now is that Petro is going to Washington next week. Let's remember that after the attack in Caracas took place and Maduro was extracted, Petro was very critical. And speaking in Air Force One, Donald Trump said that Petro better watch his ass, to quote him literally. So afterwards, sort of both presidents spoke. Petro had called a rally in Plaza de Bolívar in Bogotá, and he was supposed to give a fiery speech, and he put that aside. And of course, the change of tone was quite dramatic, but we will see how the meeting in the White House goes. And yesterday, Petro again spoke at an act, and he said that Maduro should be sent back to Caracas in order to stand trial. So there are all these conflicting messages in which, as you know, that Petro sometimes leans towards being a statesperson and some other times leans towards being a populist. And we are in the middle of a campaign. He is excellent reading public opinion. He sometimes you feel inclined to distance himself from Washington and making Trump, of course, an antagonist. And of course, that will have political consequences. Let's have in mind that Iván Cepeda, who is the candidate from Pacto Histórico from the left, and will be Petro's successor, is leading the polls. So, of course, all of this has political implications for the elections. First, we have legislative elections at the beginning of March, and of course, we have the first round of the presidential elections at the end of May. And of course, Petro, the situation in the Oval Office could easily get out of hand. Let's remember what happened with Zelensky the first time he went to Washington and Vance was president. So again, it's a riddle, and we will have a clearer picture 1 week from today. But again, the dangers of entering into the same vicious cycle that we saw a year ago when Petro criticized the deportations, and the one that we saw at the beginning of this year when even the U.S. threatened that some attacks could take place against Colombia. Of course, that's worrying. Let me also remind you that during his speech in Davos, Donald Trump said that the U.S. have been very successful in curtailing the transport of narcotics by sea. He mentioned that 97.3% of narcotics were not entering the U.S. by using using ships, but he also mentioned that soon we will begin terrestrial operations, which is easier, and that implies that something is coming. And of course, knowing that, of course, most production facilities are in Colombia, that's a worrying sign. If one of the results of what happens in the White House is that both countries agree to conduct operations and against laboratories, and Colombia, of course, is showing that last year, for example, it intercepted almost 1,000 tons of cocaine, which is a record. If that happens, things could evolve positively. But again, knowing the personalities of both Trump and Petro, of course, there's a real probability that things will deteriorate again. And we'll see what happens after.
Ricardo, thank you. Just a really quick question, and then I want to go back to Bob. But the security agenda is big on the agenda again in Colombia, right? For an election or so or two, it had moved away. It's now front and center again. Not the only issue, but certainly an important one. And when you talk about security in Colombia, you always talk about the ties to the U.S. military and the collaboration with the U.S. government. Is there some sense, even in the center right or somewhere located on the right, of some sympathy for what Mark Carney was saying at Davos?
No, no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I believe that that most candidates sort of are following the same line in terms when they speak out international relations. So I believe that the words of Mark Carney also resonated in Colombia quite loudly. Uh, but again, the big question is, will Colombia be part of the solution in terms of trying to sort of being more friendly towards its contradictors? Let's remember, for example, that when Cast was elected in Chile, Petro said that they just had elected a Nazi. So I mean, that's not a very friendly way of conducting international relations. So Petro has to restrain himself. And of course, Petro's successor will have to reveal many relationships that have been damaged by Petro's outbursts. But we will see all that, and depends, of course, on who wins.
Thank you, Ricardo. Bob, I'll come back to you, and it's playing off a little bit of one of the questions we had that we've received from the audience. Thank you for the question. Does Canada want, or is it feasible for Canada to lead the middle powers movement? Now, I think you might say Canada has a lot on its plate right now domestically, but let me add an aspect to that. In your number of years at the United Nations, you spoke with ambassadors and ministers and heads of state from countries throughout the world, and including Latin America. Do you have a sense that, from what the conversations that you've had, that there is some possibility of developing a coalition amongst Latin American countries, or Canada working in concert with some or all Latin American countries on some basic principles of multilateral governance?
The answer is yes. But let me just elaborate briefly. There's always this issue of, do you want to lead? And my view is, it's not about one country saying we want to lead. It's about a number of countries saying together, we want to be part of this effort. And we want to have some serious dialogue about how it's going to happen. And that obviously includes many countries in Latin America. As I said, it's not limited regionally. It includes countries in Africa and Asia and Europe as well. Even in the Middle East, there's, I think, a strong desire for many, many countries to figure out a way to deal better with what we've all described as the unpredictability, the imperiousness of the approach that's taken, the reassertion of domination and dominance as the sort of the key issue. And I think we have to understand something, that I consider this kind of rhetoric and the activities that are expressed by President Trump and by his associates as actually a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength.
Yes.
The way in which they carry on it doesn't sound like an immensely self-confident group of people. It sounds like people who are desperate to assert their dominance because they're not sure they still have it. And when you look at the relationships, for example, between China and the Americas, broadly speaking, including the Caribbean, China has been a very active financier, has been a very active economic partner. has been directly engaged with countries through the BRICS, that institution that's been created. And all this has taken place without the United States figuring out how do we respond to this. They're not opening up the World Bank. They're not changing the IMF so it becomes even more responsive to the needs of the global South. And they refuse to budge on any of these issues. And so this kind of unpredictability and slightly chaotic nature of the world order is inevitable, given the inability of the United States to figure out where it fits and how it can reassert and assert itself in a constructive way. If you read history, not even have to go back to Thucydides, but if you look at the issue of the rise and fall of great powers, it's never a pretty story. The beginning of it is chaotic, and the assertion of power is chaotic, and then the administration of power is pretty tough, but it's at least stable with a lot of order. And then the next phase is disorderly. And I think we're in the next phase. I think we're in a disorderly phase because the old power is very reluctant to share power. And yet, effectively, if America wants to have a strong role to play in the world going forward, it has to learn how to share power. And some administrations have been more or less willing or able to do that. None of them have had the ability to talk to their people about how there's actually nothing exceptional about the United States in the sense of it's better than and superior to and always will be every other country. That is just pure ideology, just flying out of your mouth. It's got nothing to do with the reality of a situation. And nobody has power forever. So Canada, I think we're in this because we're the ham in every sandwich. We don't have any choice but to articulate the moment we're in and to try to figure out how do we deal effectively with this and to talk to other countries about it. And I don't think that people should be surprised that much that Canada is doing this. I mean, if you look at Suez in 56 as a moment in which powers were suddenly transferred from the British and the French to the Americans saying to the British and the French and the Israelis, what the hell are you guys up to? You really think you can get away with this? I don't think so. We're not going to let you. And Canada played a key middle role in kind of saying to the Brits, it's kind of not on, guys. You're not going to make it this time. So don't try. And it was able to play in that role. And I think this is a role we have to play today, where we are reminding people. Our position on the Middle East, for example, has been very different from the United States over the last 5 years, even under the Biden administration. We've been reasserting the need for self-determination for the Palestinians. We've been asserting ourselves into the middle of a number of processes and trying to engage. On financing for development, we played a role of trying to bargain and trying to bring greater consensus in the UN system so that we could move forward. Very much not embraced by the Americans, even under Biden, but completely rejected by Trump. But this kind of know-nothing approach where you say, no, we're not doing anything with these things. We're not going to do anything that will promote climate resilience, and we're not going to do anything that's going to help countries to deal with it. The contrast that I felt most strongly out of Davos was running those two speeches together between Carney's speech and Mr. Trump's speech. The two speeches were totally different, not only in tone, but in, frankly, real confidence. Rather, there was no swagger in what Carney had to say. We're not a country that swaggers, but we are a country that understands that we need to talk to each other and engage. Now, the word is one thing, the deed is the other. And I think the real challenge for everyone is to figure out what are the deeds, what are the things we need to do to actually make this thought a reality. And everybody knows that there's a gap between the word and the deed and how we actually implement the strategy in the face of tremendous opposition from parts of the American administration and the American political culture. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very, very tough. But I think Mr. Carney's strength is that he's been able to describe the moment we're in, and he has some ideas about how that might work. And he needs friends to be able to pull this off in a way that is going to be constructive. And I think that's something that we all need to work on together.
Thank you, Bob. I'm conscious of the hard stop on the hour. I just when Marta appears, I know that our time is definitely up. But Hussein, if I could just have a 30-second response to this question. I alluded to it earlier. President Lula has certainly wanted to project himself, has projected himself as the leader, a leader of the global South. Circumstances have changed. We've talked about this for an hour. In the current circumstances, is Brazil coming up with new ideas, or Lula, that can be presented? For example, one might we imagine that in a Mark Carney visit to Brazil in April or May, that this will be an item that will be on the agenda, reimagining or reconstructing some other way for the rest of the world to live by some rules. 30 seconds, Hussein.
I don't know. I think Lula never postulated to be the leader of the global South. I think Brazil is too sizable, too big, and has a lot of resources. So Brazil by itself, it is a very important country in the global South. And Lula has played an important foreign policy, which naturally project him as a leader. And his charisma also play an important role. I think Carney visit and Lula to Brazil will be very impacted by all means for the private sector, for both countries, will be impacted to build an important coalition in the hemisphere among Latin American and Caribbean states, and also in the multilateral system, how to engineer a bloc of middle power countries, and at least in some topics to construct a consensus, not broader in all topics, but at least in some topics to build consensus. I think they will be capable to achieve the minimum denominator on important key files regard to that. And you have to remember, just to conclude, we have in Latin America in South America, 3 important presidential elections: April in Peru, May in Colombia, and October in Brazil. And the main concerns that we have, what Washington will do, especially interfering in the electoral process of these countries, and especially in Brazil. This is a crucial. We do not discard the hypothesis that they will interfere in the electoral cycle. Perhaps not Trump himself, but his associates and his movement. They will try to endorse the Bolsonaro during the electoral cycle, and how that will damage the bilateral relationship between both countries.
Okay. Thank you for keeping to that time. Thank you, Hussein. Thank you to all of you. Robert and Ricardo, we would like to have heard more from you, but this was a pretty fulsome conversation for an hour. So I turn it over to Marta. You're on mute, Marta.
Think I would have learned after 6 years. But thanks, Ken. Many thanks to Ricardo, Hussein, Robert, and a special thank you to Bob for joining us today and for support of CCA. Thank you all for sticking with us, even though we're just a little bit over the hour. I'll just take the opportunity to highlight that today's discussion obviously reflects the CCA's ongoing commitment to strengthening Canada's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean. And we encourage you all to visit and explore our Beyond the Build strategy paper, which it presents a new Canadian strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's available on our website at ccacanada.com, on our homepage, as well as on a separate page, Beyond the Build. And we're looking forward to continuing this conversation throughout this year. We'll have the videos of today's event posted in English, French, and Spanish. And again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Merci y gracias a todos.
Obrigado, Hussein. Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Robert. Gracias, Ricardo.
Bye-bye.
Gracias.